inviting me to talk about companion planting. Haley mentioned some of our University of Maryland Extension resources. So they're all collected on the Home and Garden Information Center landing page. You can find lots of information on a wide variety of topics. We also have a blog, we have a YouTube channel, lots of videos, social media, and this really nice service called Ask Extension. So we're able to receive questions from the public, from master gardeners, 24/7 Maryland residents. You can send photos and we can help answer your questions about anything related to your gardens, your landscape, pest issues, etc. I also wanted to mention we have a brand new Maryland Master Gardener Handbook that was just released, and it's available for sale. If you go to the Maryland Master Gardener website, you'll see a tab for the handbook and you can check it out. All right, so we're going to talk about companion planting. Unlike animals, plants cannot move around to get what they need. They're stuck in one place and they're constantly interacting with everything in their environment. Soil microorganisms, insects, the weather. And so this topic, this concept of companion planting really has us asking ourselves the question, how do we make decisions about where we put our plants, which plants we put together? What kinds of criteria do we use? For some of us, it may be aesthetics. It may be that certain plants grow best in certain parts of our yard. So in the photo here on the left, we have a wide variety of Asian greens that are being grown close together. And the gardener is going to come in with scissors and cut these baby greens for a period of time, use them together in the kitchen. All these plants have very similar growing requirements. So it makes a lot of sense that we would plant them together like that. Now, the photo on the right either is going to put a big smile on your face or it will terrify you. I found this photo really interesting. A person who wanted to surprise her children with lots of pumpkins in the fall decided to plant them in a couple of beds around the house. Now, of course, they're sprawling across the lawn. So the pumpkins are certainly going to smother or injure the collection of weed species and grass species growing in this lawn. Maybe the gardener really doesn't care too much, but this is an example of companions that maybe weren't meant to be, but still very interesting. Maybe she'll turn the whole yard into a garden. I think this is a pretty good definition of companion planting, at least as the way I understand it. If you go online, you can find many websites, many articles, at least 10 cooperative extension service fact sheets and articles on companion planting. The book on the left here, Great Garden Companions, is actually written by a former Cornell extension agent. And it's one that I find is more science-based than some other resources. Now, one of the most popular and well-known books on companion planting is Carrots Love Tomatoes. And that came out, I think, in the mid-70s. It was written by Louise Riot, who was an Oklahoma gardener and garden writer. I think she had like 12 books. And one thing about companion planting is it's not a new concept. Like a lot of things that seem to be new in the gardening world, they're really not so new. So, for example, you may recognize this as the Three Sisters gardening scheme. It's also known as the Milpa. It's an agro system that's been around for thousands of years. And here we can see the three main components, the three primary plants: corn, beans, and squash growing along the ground. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation. So companion gardening resources that you find online are really a collection of things that are based on science. And in some cases, we have some research studies that support these recommendations. In other cases, they're based on folklore, observations, things like planting by the phases of the moon. One thing I noticed quickly while I was researching this topic is there's a certain list that keeps showing up, and it starts with asparagus. And this is a pretty typical way that companion planting is presented on a lot of web pages and a lot of written materials. And that is, we've got companions. So these are plants, and these are usually vegetable crops that are that should grow well together. That's the suggestion. The companions do well together. And then we see allies, and those are going to typically be flowering plants and herb plants that will either attract insects that we want or repel insects that we don't want. And then we've got the enemies list. And this is supposedly the list of plants that together do not grow well for some reason. And so you find this repeated. I go to seed company websites, I see the same list. And in this case, the way it's formatted, you can see it's from an extension office. So this was a former North Dakota State University extension agent who produced this, and you can find it on a lot of people's blogs and web pages. I think this came out in about 2013. But I don't know where this extension agent got all the information that he used to compile this list. But one thing we can see pretty quickly is that some of the claims and some of the recommendations just are not supported by either observation or by research. So, when we learned that, kohlrabi stunts tomato growth, I couldn't find anything that would, corroborate that statement. So you really have to take some of this with a grain of salt. In looking at lots of different resources, you find there is conflicting information between different sources and even between research studies that have been done looking at these different planting combinations. So it's very interesting. When I started to research this topic, and I had never really done a talk specifically about companion planting, I thought about what my goals are when I teach people and work with people in the food gardening area. What I'm really interested in is human health and well-being, and that extends to, community well-being and decreasing food insecurity, good, healthy food for us all to share. And I'm also thinking about how does food gardening, how can it really improve ecosystem health and make our gardens more climate resilient? So that's the context that I'm sort of seeing companion planting in. How does companion planting help, achieve these goals? Maybe these are goals that you have as well. So I personally find the companion planting concept a little bit constricting. It's got a little bit of a narrow scope in that, the recommendations that are presented typically are plant these two plants together, don't plant this plant with that plant. And I think it helps to think about it more broadly. What we're really after is increasing biodiversity in our gardens. We're interplanting, we're making intentional decisions about selecting plants, when to plant them, so the timing and the space that they'll occupy, and which ones will grow best together for lots of different reasons. That's a big, broad concept. It goes beyond companion planting. Again, it's really about increasing biodiversity. And so that bigger concept is similar to or connected to other big concepts like permaculture or food forest, or in our own backyard here, we have the Baywise landscaping program, which is a principal program of the Master Gardener program. And it helps people learn how to grow their gardens and landscapes more sustainably. Everything from, building soil health and making compost and attracting beneficial insects and reducing pesticide use, managing stormwater. So it's the big picture. And we even have a Baywise landscaping yardstick, so a way to measure your progress for food gardens. So that's going to be my approach today, is looking at the big picture. And what I really would like to do is focus on three aspects of companion planting or interplanting. We'll look at pollination and pest management. And here you can see in the photo tomatoes with marigolds growing at the, I don't know how many marigold plants there are there, but the marigolds can do a few things for the garden. They have a very strong aroma. And so they have these chemicals that are released by the plant, volatiles that can perhaps confuse insects that are looking for their host plant, tomatoes in this case. The flowers can attract some beneficial insects. And we also know that through their roots, African and French marigolds will release chemicals that can actually help suppress nematodes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So pollination and pest management, I want to also talk about ways that interplanting can increase garden productivity. And finally, to talk about how cover crops can be wonderful companion plants in your garden. Okay, pollination and pest management. So, of course, we want more pollinators in our garden, especially if we're growing any plants in the cucumber family, which all require cross-pollination to produce fruits. And so we want lots of bees and other pollinators. Natural enemies, for people that aren't familiar with that term, we're talking about insects that help to control pest insects. And those would be predators like this mantid here that's bitten off the head of a brown marmorated stink bug, and parasitoids. And we'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. So I want to just introduce three natural enemies that are pretty common in Maryland gardens. We have on the left the syrphid fly. So it looks like a bee, but it's actually a fly. And here it is feeding on nectar and pollen. And this syrphid fly also controls pests through its larval stage. So below, this is a really cool looking gentle fly that lands on your flowers. It's fun to look at. This is a vicious predator below. This is its larval form. It hunts down soft-bodied insects. Here it's consuming aphids. So at this stage, it's a predator. It doesn't need flowers for a source of energy, but the adult form, this fly isn't going to be eating other insects. It needs to use nectar and pollen for its energy source. Here we've got the goldenrod soldier beetle, and both the adult and its larval form will eat other insects, but the adult also will feed on nectar and pollen. So very important, right, to have flowering plants around. And finally, on the right, we've got an interesting wasp parasitoid. So it's got these two yellow dots on its abdomen. As an adult, it's feeding, on the nectar and pollen of different flowering plants. But what this insect does is it lays its eggs on host insects. So mostly white grubs in the soil, like June beetle, Japanese beetle grubs. And those eggs hatch inside the grubs, and the larvae, the maggots, develop and basically consume the insides of these insects. And so providing natural control. So the important thing to think about is, what do these natural enemies and pollinators need? And they need what flowers can provide: shelter, nectar, pollen, and alternate prey. So we want to have a robust, biodiverse landscape that will be able to also maintain a population of prey insects, so that the natural enemies will stay with us through the growing season and not just for short periods of time. So one important thing to insert here, I think, is that This is really a wonderful way to diversify your landscape and build in biocontrol. I mean, there's nothing more exciting to me than walking through a garden where there's a border of mixed flowers and it's teeming with buzzing, diving insects of all sizes that are feeding on the nectar and pollen. It's really a great experience to have. Having said that, it doesn't mean that having that flower border is going to be the end of all your pest issues. Yes, you're going to have some biocontrol built in there, but we also need to continue to monitor our plants to see where pests are popping up. We still want to hand pick them when possible, use row cover to exclude insect pests. So this is just one really important tool in the overall management of pest issues. So which plant families work best? So I think a mixture of perennials and annuals. These are three families that we know through research are great at attracting and conserving. So we not only want to bring the insects in, we want to provide that shelter and that continuous supply of nectar and pollen that'll keep them there. So the aster family, lots of members to choose from. Mustard family with the disc-shaped flowers, and the pea family. These are great families to concentrate on. But of course, the mint family also has many members that produce flowers that will be very attractive to beneficial insects. Apiaceae, the dill family, parsley, cilantro, as well. Plants like buckwheat. Alyssum is a plant that's often mentioned as a good attractant for beneficial insects, and alyssum is a member of the Brassica family, Brassicaceae. So here we have a solitary bee feeding on the disc flowers of asters, and on the left is just one example of what a border can be, what it can look like. It can be along the perimeter of a garden. You can have a border within the garden. Some people like to simply intersperse different flowering plants with their vegetables, and that's fine too. I think having a solid border, even if it's only a few feet wide, actually is a little more beneficial than having random flowering plants, interspersed through your garden, because you're providing a dense sheltering area for the beneficial. And these are some herb plants that can be very good at attracting pollinators and natural enemies. We mentioned dill and this whole family with their umbels, these small flowers, and chives, which of course is in the onion family. So in addition to attracting beneficial insects, we can use herbs and other plants to repel or deter pests. Here we've got a fall planting of Asian greens, looks like mustards, and we see a rosemary plant. And this gardener had learned that rosemary has chemicals that are released through the leaves that can help either deter certain pests like whitefly and aphids, or by emitting these chemicals into the air can confuse insects that are searching for a host plant. So they get the wrong chemical cues, they get confused, and they can't then locate the plant that they would like to feed on. So is this going to work? Well, research does support it, but the thing to remember is these are all biological systems. A lot depends on the time of year, the maturity of the plant, how many, to what degree are chemicals being released based on the developmental stage of the plant. This can also be driven by temperature. During warmer weather, we're going to have more volatiles released by these plants. So it's not like, when you spray a pesticide, you kind of know what's going to happen. Here, it's a lot more, the results can be a little more uncertain, but the plan here is solid because we do know through research that rosemary can help to deter pest insects. So it's a good time to mention that 2025 is the year of herbs for the Grow It, Eat It program, which is another Master Gardener sub-program along with the Baywise program. And on the Master Gardener website, we've got a lot of good resources listed under the Volunteer Resources tab that will be helpful to you, hopefully, in growing herbs in your garden. So these are a few examples of where research results do support, different interplanting schemes where mostly herbs, but also alliums certainly that are emitting volatile compounds, which again can either confuse pest insects or deter them. Nasturtium is another plant species that shows up frequently in research results that have shown efficacy for some of these different plant combinations. Basil, rosemary, and lavender, also because of strong chemicals that volatilize from the plant, are in the air, and can help repel or deter insect pests. And here's a photo of tomatoes with African marigolds, which are actually from Mexico, but they're called African marigolds. And if we know we do have, say, a root knot nematode issue in our soils, planting marigolds and then turning them into the soil where they decompose and then can release compounds that are effective at suppressing nematodes in the soil. So it can work. Now, another phenomenon that does occur in nature is allelopathy, whereby certain plants exude compounds through their roots that will suppress the growth of adjacent plants. So we know this happens with sunflower, Jerusalem artichoke, walnuts, and rye, annual rye. So if you grow annual rye as a cover crop in your vegetable garden, in the spring when that cover crop is decomposing, it can interfere with the germination of seeded crops, especially small seeded crops. If you plant kale seeds or lettuce seeds, the decomposing rye can chemically inhibit germination. But if you're putting transplants into the ground, you really won't have any problem. I've been growing rye for many years, and I've never really seen an issue, even when I plant bean seeds into the residues, a few weeks after they've broken down. So we can use certain herb plants and other plants to repel and deter pest insects. Another concept is trap cropping. This is the idea of planting certain plants or crops that are in the species that you're trying to protect. So, for example, here are Colorado potato beetles. On the left is the adult. It's on eggplant, the eggs in the middle, and then on the right is an eggplant plant, along with 20 of its partners that were badly decimated by Colorado potato beetle. So this insect, even though it's named for potato, actually prefers eggplant. So can we use it to lure the pest away from the desired crop, the potatoes, and have those insects instead infest the trap crop? And I have never seen this, but I have heard from my colleagues that on certain potato farms, farmers do plant eggplant at the head of potato row so that they can, the eggplant plants can attract and trap those Colorado potato beetles. So what then? Well, then the farmer has to spray those eggplant plants when they're fully loaded with Colorado potato beetle, or pull them out of the ground, destroy them. You can't just leave them there. So that's the concept for trap cropping. There's actually a fair bit of research that's been done on organic farms showing that it can be effective. Couple of examples, they've used collard greens planted on the perimeter of cabbage fields to attract and trap diamondback moths, which is a bad pest of cabbage. They've used blue Hubbard squash, which is a large winter squash. It's Cucurbita maxima. It makes really large leaves, very large plant. And when they've planted it at the corners, pumpkin fields or squash fields or along the perimeter, they find that squash bugs, cucumber beetles, and squash vine borer will go to the blue Hubbard crop preferentially. So it can work as a trap crop. In a vegetable garden, I don't think it's going to have as much use. I mean, you have to know which pest you're trying to protect your crops from. Are they coming in from outside the garden? Have they overwintered in the garden? And so I don't know that this will really be very valuable. In this case, for the potatoes and the eggplants growing in the garden, it's really a matter of monitoring the plants, finding the egg masses, hand picking them or using a row cover. But it is an interesting concept. Here is where it could be used to trap harlequin bugs. So on the left, we see this very significant pest. It's a true bug that attacks all members of the cabbage family. Here it's on red Russian kale. These are two adults. And we know that Cleome, which actually has taxonomically been moved into the cabbage family, also can attract harlequin bug and may actually be a stronger attractant than the kale plant. So if you've ever tried this, you may find that you'll have lots more harlequin bugs on your Cleome, at which point you don't want to kill your Cleome. Maybe you're going to then just spend time hand picking harlequin bugs off so that they don't go to the kale. But again, there are other ways to control harlequin bug, especially using a row cover, which is very effective. But so just another possible trap crop scenario. Okay, so I would like to now talk about how we can use interplanting to make our gardens more productive. Basically, how it can help us make the best use of our gardening space. So two ways to think about it. I mean, there are more ways than this, but this is what I thought about when I was putting the presentation together. We can look at interplanting based on plant structure, how tall they get, what their canopies are like, what their light needs are. And then we can also look at plants in terms of their crop cycle. Do they grow during the cool part of the year, or are they warm season crops? Do they mature quickly? And can we combine different crops based on their crop cycle? And there are lots of related techniques to companion planting or interplanting. Planting more densely or intensive planting, vertical gardening, which is really key to increasing productivity in the garden. Succession planting, so once one crop is finished and it comes out, we can plant a next crop in, making, again, the best use of the garden. So vertical gardening, super helpful for creating good interplanting scenarios. On the left, a lot of people don't support their eggplant and pepper plant, but we know that the stems of these plants can flop over, they can break with the weight of fruit. So it's really very helpful to install some kind of support system. Here we've got wooden stakes with the peppers, these little conical cages that are sold as tomato cages, but they work better as pepper cages. And in the upper right, I love this. This is a community gardener who grew these nice sized watermelons on cattle panel frame that he created. And underneath the frame, where it's more shaded, of course, he's got shade tolerant plants growing. So a nice interplanting arrangement there. And of course, cucumbers will sprawl and cover the ground, and that can really waste a lot of space. They will produce straighter cucumbers and cleaner cucumbers if you get them off the ground. So we had mentioned the Milpa agro system used in Mesoamerica. And of course, this system moved up throughout North America. And for native peoples who used this particular system, this predominantly apparently occurred in the northeastern area region, Great Lakes region. And it's been called the Three Sisters Garden because, of course, it's corn, beans, and squash. So this is an illustration of a planting scheme where we have a large mounded area of soil, but in the middle, we've created a well, a shallow well, where corn is planted, 4 kernels, 6 inches apart. And of course, this could vary a lot, but this is one source that I found. And then, of course, a pole bean plant planted at the base of the corn once the corn is up 6 or 12 inches, and the bean will, of course, climb up the corn. And then on the outside, about 2 feet away from the center, a couple of squash plants, and those plants will sprawl on the ground, giving us some weed control, keeping the soil cooler and reducing evaporation of moisture out of the soil. So these plants work well together. They have the same growing season. They have similar plant needs. They can provide a complete diet. They can all be dried and stored as, food crops that can be used through the winter. And on the right, you can see, and somebody had the bright idea to try it in a large fabric bag. So that was kind of a cool way to actually create that Three Sisters garden in a small space. So this works for a lot of different reasons. The corn, as I mentioned, supports the beans. The beans aren't going to fix as much nitrogen as other legumes, but they will fix nitrogen. So add nitrogen back to the soil after the plants decompose. And other plants can be added to this scheme and were by native peoples. But this is just a really nice example of an interplanting a scheme that has worked well for thousands of years. So in thinking about our space above and below ground, I share these 2 photos. On the left, very healthy looking tomato plants, and it looks like we have basil and maybe some other plants growing on the outside of these plants, maybe a foot or so away. But then we've got this cucumber plant that I really have a lot of questions about. Is it going to be able to survive in this amount of shade? Is it going to get what it needs to grow and produce fruits? I have my doubts. Maybe if it was on the south side of this row of tomatoes and it was a bush cucumber, perhaps it will. But we really have to think about what are the plant needs of all the partners in the scenario here. And I'm not sure the cucumber is going to get what it needs. On the right, these are serrano pepper plants that I pulled out of my garden at the end of the growing season. This was in early October, I think. So it's a destructive harvest. I'm stripping all the peppers off to use them. And of course, when I pulled them out, I left a lot of roots in the ground, and that's great because those roots will decompose and add to the organic matter in the soil. But you'll notice it's not a huge root system. Certainly, it's taking up a lot less area than the canopy above did. And so it may be possible to plant other plants that are more shade tolerant, perhaps, in close proximity to these pepper plants, as long as we're providing enough water, enough nutrients, and light benefit both crops. So here's just some examples of successful interplanting. On the left, bell pepper with basil that looks very healthy. I don't think this is a compact variety. It's growing along the edge, so it's getting enough sunlight. Now, of course, one of the downsides of intensive planting and this type of interplanting is reducing air circulation around plants. So you've just really got to keep an eye on things. If I needed to prune a few pepper branches to increase air circulation, I might do that. But both partners here look like they're doing pretty well. And then in the middle, we have eggplant with parsley, curly parsley growing. Again, looks very like it's growing very well. Both plants getting what they need. And then on the right, a bed of collards. And I don't know if anybody can tell what this crop, it wasn't interplanted, it just showed up. So this is purslane, common purslane, which is a very good weed to eat. And these gardeners, this is in a community garden in Baltimore, they were doing just that. And they were also getting the benefit of the purslane suppressing weed growth in this bed. So a few other examples. On the left, something I've noticed in gardens that are planted by Haitians, West Africans, Bhutanese, Nepalese gardeners, is corn shows up a lot, planted on the edges of beds and not close together, like Americans that may plant 6 to 9 inches apart. These plants are more like 18 inches apart along the edges. So we've got lots of room for other plants to grow without being affected by the corn's interception of sunlight. There's still plenty of light, plenty of nutrients and water. In the middle, using okra, interplanted with this cut leaf sweet potato variety. Looks like it's working out pretty well. The okra has an open canopy, and yes, it's limiting to some degree the light reaching the sweet potatoes, but not enough to really have a negative impact. So it looks like it's working out really well. And on the right, okra used again. In this case, we can see a muskmelon plant. It looks like both plants are being managed well and succeeding. So interplanting in space and time. On the left, this is pretty clever. We've got lettuces that this is probably early June. They've grown very well, produced a lot. Now we've got a trellis that's been erected over them, and we've got cucumber plants that are just now germinating, and it will climb the trellis. That'll shade the lettuce, but this lettuce is probably on its way out. But we can replant this bed with a shade-tolerant leafy green that can also take some heat during the summer. In the middle, onions, which were planted before the tomatoes were set out, and now they'll be harvested. This is probably mid-July. They'll come out of the ground. Another crop can replace them. So it's an example of succession planting. But the interplanting seems to work here. Both plants getting what they need. These onions, being in the allium family, may also be helping to deter or repel whitefly or aphids on the tomatoes. And on the right, cabbages need to be spaced if they're full-size varieties that make large heads. They need to be given a couple of feet of space. So that's wasted space. Sure, we could mulch it, but we could also plant lettuce. So once those cabbages are in the ground and established, we can sow lettuce seed and create a really nice leaf lettuce cutting garden around our cabbage plants. And a lot of people, I think, may have heard about, if you follow companion planting, the interplanting of radish and carrot. So radishes are coming out of the ground in 25, 30 days. Carrots are going to take 2 to 3 times that amount of time before they are ready to harvest. And so usually the plants are, I think, closer together, but the idea is the carrots can serve as row markers, but also once they come out, then there's more light and more resources, nutrients, and water to support the carrot. And on the right, these are mustard greens that were planted on the north side of some tomato plants. And you can see the shade that's being cast by the plants and the stakes. And so mustard doesn't like really hot weather in the summer, and this can help it go a little bit longer. And a couple of slides. These are from a neighbor of mine who has created this amazing garden in his backyard. Multi-tiered shelves here that are on a western-facing wall, different flowering plants and herbs, and then below, leafy greens that can tolerate shade. Further out in these beds are greens that can tolerate less shade, and they're getting more sun. In the photo on the right, this is a really cool trellis. This is Malabar spinach growing up the trellis, and there are 2 levels of grow trays that can support different plants with different needs. So at the top, we're going to get more light interception. We can grow plants that can more of our typical warm season crops like basil and pepper. And the lower shelf will grow more shade tolerant crops. So just a real clever use here to create the ability to plant multiple species. And I would be remiss if I didn't include an example of edible landscaping. This is another neighbor of mine who just removed some foundation plants and planted a variety of vegetables. There are eggplant plants, pepper, basil, different flowers and herbs all along the front of the house and the walkways. Really a nice job. Interplanting doesn't always work out. So here's an example of a Swiss chard. This is the bright lights variety. Not getting enough light here on the left. Plants are just going to remain very small. So the plants were transplanted to an area where they would get more sun. Still an interplanting scheme. We've got tomatoes, and then in close proximity, the Swiss chard, and then I don't know what all's in here. It looks like some zinnias. On the right, this is unfortunately what can happen when you crowd plants too closely together. So we've got sweet potato and cucumber and zucchini all growing together. And that's certainly going to reduce our yields. It's going to make it very difficult to harvest the crop, and it's going to really promote pest and disease problems. So I'm going to finish by just talking a little bit about cover crops, which I think have a really important role in our vegetable gardens. And I think it's good to start to think about them as companion plants, as plants that we want to interplant with. They can keep our soil covered during the winter months, which is very important to prevent erosion. They increase soil organic matter, and they can attract beneficial insects. So here we've got cabbages growing as our main crop. We have a row, and to the left, buckwheat plants. So a narrow band of buckwheat that will attract both bees and natural enemies. And on the right, Phacelia, which is native to Mexico and the Southwest US, but we're seeing more gardeners experiment with it. So both buckwheat and Phacelia can be used as a spring and summer cover crop. If you've got some bare ground, or you just want to try it as a companion plant. It's in the borage family, Phacelias. You can tell by these flowers. It's great at attracting bees and natural enemies. Buckwheat is a great cover crop to start with if you've never grown a cover crop. Now it's going to be spring and summer. It's got a long flowering period and these well-developed nectaries. This is a parasitoid wasp that's feeding on the nectar here. And if you like it, and it's in a spot where you're not planning on growing anything else, it will reseed freely. So it can actually grow pretty much all summer long. And this is just an example of, if you wanted to get started with a cover crop, but you don't like the idea of taking out your tomatoes and peppers that are growing well, let's just pretend that's what's growing on these mounds here, these raised beds. This is actually later in the summer. It might be mid-September. So, we could pretend there are tomatoes there. What we're doing is we're planting winter wheat or rye in the walkway. So in this case, what we have planted is mustard for a fall crop, and sowed the annual rye in the walkways. And this is what it looked like later that fall. And so we can walk on the rye. It's not going to really be a problem to harvest the mustard greens. So it's a way to get the best out of, two worlds. The cover crop will improve the soil, and the mustard greens are going to help to feed us. And this is what it looks like when you plant a cover crop in September, October. These are small rye plants and crimson clover plants. And then just a couple days later, look at the growth that's made. So they'll continue to grow. They will go dormant over the winter and regrow in the spring. And then we can cut them down and smother those cover crop plants. And what's happening through the winter is those cover crop plant roots are continuing to grow. And so in that rhizosphere, we've got lots of microorganisms that are being fed by the sugars and other compounds being exuded by the roots of the cover crops. So we're actually building up our microbial populations, and that's adding to the organic matter in the soil. So in the spring, those residues will decompose and add more organic matter and help suppress weeds. And here we can see a sweet potato plant happily growing in the middle of those residues. So good interplanting relationship. And I'll be happy to share the presentation as a PDF if Emily and Haley would like to distribute it to folks, because there are a bunch of resources that you might benefit from. And I will just conclude with a request that you evaluate the presentation today. You can take a photo of the QR code, or we can put this into the chat. This just helps me with my bosses. So I would appreciate if folks could take a minute at some point, not right now, but sometime later, to evaluate the presentation.